Could we call that a platform? That's a good term.
Okay, I have a couple of process issues, and I can either do that before or after.
Can I address what you said?
Yes,
I think
kind of
let me make sure I'm understanding. You know that, and of course, you know, back in the XP, you know, there was questioning the idea of using effectiveness and can you really relate a team to the open source community. And back then, actually, we were looking at the team effectiveness being just the output measures, how much software was produced. So that's kind of that first part of what you're saying, that's the output part. But since then, what's happened is we've added in activity. So activity is how many downloads, how many page views. And what I would argue is that in some respects, these project communities are really little markets. Because if you think about it, and let's relate it to a software development team. If you were to say, what's an effective software development team? Well, if I understand right, effectiveness, typically you go to the leader and say, was this effective? And basically, based on certain criteria, you know, it's a typical way to measure effectiveness of a team. Software teams produce software, open source communities produce software, sometimes the same, couldn't tell the difference. So, what determines an effective software development team? Well, I would think it's how quality of that software, how it's accepted, would be key measures, right? So, in the case of open source communities, as reported in the XP, we just stopped at the output. Now we extend it to activity, and I would argue that that activity is actually a response of the market, of kind of the immediate market in terms of what's happening. So, it might be misleading the way I put it up there, because, you know, there I'm talking about these really broad, long-term kind of market impacts. You know, that Linux, for example, is now an industry standard. You know, and these are things that have so many other factors involved: strategy, structure, the computer industry, and so forth. But if you look at each one of these projects, I would say, you know, they really are a mini market. And to the extent that activity is generated, and you see higher levels of activity, I think that is a measure of effectiveness. I think it's saying that this software must have been good enough because these volunteers have come and they downloaded it, they took page views, and there's activity that was resulting from that. So I would say I think we have at least gone to the second level. I think we do capture that. It would be good to go on, I agree with you. But in some respects, that was also our study design, because if you take too big of a picture here and try to bite off too much, so many other factors get involved that, you know, you really maybe can't even sort out what's happening. So when you limit it to that 2 years, we're limiting some of these really long-term impacts, but I do think we are seeing things that are at least roughly corresponding to effectiveness of teams. And again, if you think of a software development team versus a software development community, I think what we're measuring probably correlates fairly well with if you went to the head of a software development team and asked about effectiveness. Okay, these are probably the things that they would talk about.
Let's say then that we're okay with the measure, but then why are the findings counterintuitive to what the literature says?
Well, because I think this is fundamentally different. Even though you create the same software, it's a fundamentally different process. And that is reflected in the kinds of networks that support it. So I think there's no simple, easy answer to point to it, but I think that I believe is the answer. It is fundamentally different. I don't think it's in the measures. I think it's in the both.
In the literature on workers, which is usually more of a pattern,
right?
Does that literature essentially study the same type of organization each time?
No. That's quite a range of organizations.
Okay.
The one meta study had 37 different studies. They were all different kinds of teams.
They're all over the place.
Yeah.
So the literature is that you study all different types of ways organizing work, and they basically, the pattern is this.
Yeah.
And now you come along with something, another way of organizing work.
Right. And I think that's the stark reality, and where you have to say, I think what you're saying is this is evidence for the fact, yes, this is different, radically different. And yes, it does need different measures, but, you know, and we certainly don't know all the answers as to why this has happened, but hopefully this is a first step, at least to try to try to explain it and try to maybe relate it to this idea of the platform, or whatever we call it, the cultural, socio-cultural platform. Blurb. And with the right kind of blurb. Anyway, that's also
I just had one other general observation. I noticed that when you were writing about other people's findings, that you were, you wrote it in such a way that wasn't reflective of royal we. I was always taught
wasn't reflective of?
The use of the royal word we. We find into this, we find that. I was always taught that unless you're pregnant or you have a tapeworm, you should never use the word we when it comes to your own research. The data.
So wait, for that, you have a tapeworm.
These days, I don't know if you want to volunteer on, but I was so struck by that I went back and actually counted. I thought it was really weird. But there are 265 royal wees. I'm going to ask you, please, just change those around. Read is so much better.
I'm really open to, honestly, it really is this is not, it really is.
Your dissertation.
Well, I understand, but you've got to say that.
You can make all the credit, they don't care. That's
Right.
okay.
I know, but I feel there's been a lot of inputs in this.
And I'll come back to that read, the way to make that read is publish.
Yes.
So my next question is, what's the problem that direction?
Right, so publishing, well, we've already submitted, we're co-authors. So Professor Lee and I, so published a chapter on using these as metrics. So it's kind of the idea of health metrics in open source communities and also even more generally virtual communities. But I think the actual result here, the fundamental result, it might be good to publish it and say like ISQ or maybe even ISR. But I think the question is more about title. The title would be something like, the normative social network structures in open source, or maybe what that means. I mean, because even though there's, we talked a lot today about kind of where this goes from here, I think there is a fundamental result that needs to be reported, and that is that we're seeing low closure is associated with successful projects in project communities. And that result and the support behind it, I think, that's what I would suggest would be something like a normative social structure or something like that. But also maybe something about virtual development communities that talks about the notion of developing this method, maybe like for CACM, kind of a more, management view, or we talked about maybe like work dynamics and kind of stepping back more applied and what does this mean in terms of managing development efforts. Okay.
Well, there's this one last question that I promised that I would ask you, and that is, what would you like to see your PhD student work on?
Yeah. Well, I think number one would be to maybe take this more intensive look at trying to replicate these results. We did a multiple case study, let's say, and studied open source projects.
And that's working on the details.
Bold ideas. The bold ones, I think, are beginning to address the general open source model, trying to define that, do some comparative studies against Wikipedia, maybe compare to science. E-science would be very interesting. And then I really think the idea of design research of the platform would be very interesting. You could do a lot of experimentation. That's the good part about this is it's quite easy, relatively speaking, to experiment with different platforms. There you go. Different blocks. to see what happens. You know, you could open up 10 different blocks and see differentially what happens.
Why don't you just call it different organizing principles? Forget about platform mediation.
I think I would go out there. Then it's clear that nobody knows what you're talking about.
Okay, I mean, I definitely think about that.
Basic logical organizing behavior.
Right. Well, anyway,
Wow.
wow. Are we set?
Let David take the walk.
Thank you.
Now, this is the time when I have to ask all